Welcome again to American Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip. Today we have William Gairdner. He's the author of The War Against the Family, The Great Divide, and several other books. And we're going to start today by talking about the concept of freedom versus socialism. And some people may not understand how these terms contradict each other, how they go against each other, but I would say that they are 100% incompatible. I would say by nature, socialism exists through tyranny. Socialism exists through the control of the state over every part of a person's life, over the individual, over every choice they make throughout their lives. And Bill, I'm wondering if you agree with me on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you 100%, Josh. But to be fair to the theoreticians of socialism, which I refer to as a top-down political philosophy versus a philosophy of freedom, which is a bottom-up political philosophy. All the dudes that put together socialist philosophy in the last 200 or 300 years in the West really thought it would provide human beings with the greatest form of freedom of all. And I describe that as collective freedom in my book, The Great Divide. I think theoretically, they probably have a case. I mean, part of their argument was, look, all you liberals get together in your parliaments and you fight and you scream and you yell at each other and call each other dirty names because you have opposing views on everything. And how can you ever have a unified people if you have opposing views? So we're going to bring about a single unified people and as free as possible. I mean, Marx's whole thing when he went into this was that the state would eventually wither away. You wouldn't even need government at all. You would be maximally free. History has shown us, of course, that none of that is true. None of it works out that way. The first thing that socialists do when they come to power is they beef up the police force and all the people who are from government who are supposed to be spying on everything that you're doing. So right away it becomes a top-down form of government, and quite contrary to the our Western, especially our British-based notion of freedom, which came to us through all sorts of people like John Locke and David Hume and so many others, and not through Rousseau, by the way. Well, they start militating against that and crushing everybody's liberty. So, in theory, they will defend the idea that it's the maximum form of freedom, but in practice, it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah, well, you mentioned something interesting, the ideas of Rousseau, the French Revolution, and the, say, contrast between the French model of revolution and the American model of revolution. And I think this is an interesting story to tell. Of course, in France, you had very similar revolutions take place in the United States than in France, within a gap of about, 10, 15 years, right? Wasn't that much of a gap.
Yes.
The outcomes of these two revolutions were absolutely different, though. And the systems they created were absolutely different. They couldn't have been further apart. The American system created a system of government based in the idea of self-government, that the individual should be endowed with a certain God-given right. And through that right, they should be able to choose how they live their lives. And of course, you could argue slavery, which was a leftover of British colonialism, which Americans took a while to get rid of, unfortunately. But a lot of them, of course, opposed it. It was a leftover of the mercantilism kind of state. But of course, this was very different from the French idea. The French idea was the individual is too stupid to govern himself. And so we, as the enlightened, few, should dictate how they make their choices in life, how they educate their kids, how they, choose to work, what they do with life, what they believe in. You had, of course, the de-Christianization movement and the cult of reason, which was an atheist cult, take over in France. And, movements to destroy belief, destroy the old world in a sense, right? They even remade the calendar, for example, on this new enlightened idea. And the result of that was absolute tyranny. You had the reign of terror, and you had, ankle-deep blood on the streets from the nonstop use of the guillotine. You had not just them killing the aristocracy, but you had them taking peasants out into the fields and tying them together and shooting cannons with chains tied between them and cutting people in half. I mean, horrific, horrific things. Putting people on barges and sinking them. And this was collectivism.
Yeah.
When the individual does not serve the interest of the collective, what do you do with them, right? And that was the French model. And the French model, I should note, through, you mentioned Rousseau, there was, Voltaire and other individuals played a role in this. Then, Robespierre took over during the French Revolution. His ideas went into Gracchus Babeuf. Then, he attempted a rebellion which failed and he was executed. Then into the League of the League of Outlaws, then the League of the Just, and the Communist League. And it was through the joining of the Communist League and the League of the Just that Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. There's a very clear lineage with these systems.
You're giving us an overview of Jacob Talbot's book, The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, really.
I never read that one.
It's all in there.
Interesting, yeah.
It's a terrific book. I mean, some historians find some fault with it, but it's a terrific overview of the very fine micro detail of everything you're talking about. How the French, who shocked themselves, actually, by going from their defense of, liberty, equality, fraternity, to such a bloody totalitarian state. It shocked a lot of people once it began to happen. Of course, it shocked a lot of British people who loved it and Americans who loved it. I mean, there were Jacobin cells in England. There were Jacobin cells in America. Poets like Wordsworth thought this was just a wonderful time to be alive. And eventually, of course, changed his mind and said, oh, my God, it's all backfired, But so the study of how that happened is quite interesting. And I think one of the reasons that it happened myself, and I'm no expert at it, but is because Rousseau was pushing to get rid of civil society. He thought all these free associations, family, the church, your sports club, your bridge club, your charitable organization, whatever, all these organizations were competitive with the state for the loyalty of the citizens. So let's get rid of them. We should have one people, one what he called general will, not millions and millions of individual wills, which is what all you liberals are doing in other parts of the Western world, and of course the problems in Germany and at the beginning of the 20th century were indications of that. One of the things that gave rise to Nazism was the terrible problems in the German parliaments and the German democracy. So many parties, so much scrapping, couldn't make up their minds what to do. How do you decide what to do? Well, you have one will, one people, one government, one state. And this is actually the kind of tradition that Hitler took on. One Führer. One party, one people.
Yeah, this is one of the big ironies you have when it comes to the modern socialist narrative. A lot of people, they like the idea of individualism, but they also want collectivism, and you can't have it both ways, right? There's the classical, what has become, I guess, the more conservative or even libertarian view, funny enough, which are more like classical liberals in reality. And keep in mind, liberalism at its root was based on the idea of liberty. It was absolutely opposed to the whole socialist concepts of, state control of everything. It was absolutely opposed to it. And of course, classical liberals like Ludwig von Mises and Frederick Bastiat, of course, they opposed this whole rising tyranny. But the idea of liberty as opposed, the idea of individualism as opposed to collectivism. This is an interesting point. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how these contrast each other.
Well, maybe I should explain, if I could, what I worked out in the Great Divide, which is where I think my own thinking about this came to, I guess you'd call it fruition. And that is, it seems to me, and I talk about it in the book in detail, so everyone should go by The Great Divide and read it. I can't give them the whole story here. But fundamentally, I talk about the four mutations of liberalism in the Western world. I argue that in the early days, especially when the settlers were coming to America and Canada and places like that, they were interested in what I call virtue liberalism. Their whole point was the only reason to be free is so that you can be good. That itself is kind of a shocking thing to say these days. Where do you hear anybody today say we need to be free so that we can be good? It doesn't happen. Mostly we say we need to be free so we can do whatever we want as long as we don't harm someone else and all that kind of hyper-individualism stuff, And so, but they were very different from us in wanting to be good. And that lasted for a while, and it served America and Canada well and other countries where it was imported. But it began to mutate into, especially under the influence of John Locke, into what I call individualism and property liberalism. Now that gave everything a whole different direction, freedom of enterprise, freedom of individual rights, freedom of property, and all this kind of thing. It was a kind of leaning towards what I later call hyper-individualism, where the focus is more on the individual than on the group. But I think it created a huge problem for most thinkers, even then, but especially after about 100 years in practice. And that was people began to see that freedom wasn't enough. My goodness, we have smart people, we have people not so smart, we have hardworking people, we have lazy people, we have rich people, we have poor. And we have, looks like a permanent underclass is growing in our midst. What are we going to do about it? So stage 3 of the liberal mutation, I call equality liberalism. I should rather call it forced equality. The idea here was, hey, freedom's not enough. You can't be free unless you're equal. And we have to make people more equal by government policy. Well, this was stage 3, and stage 3 brought America in particular, but also all the other countries that followed this trend, which is almost all of them, into a conflict with itself, what you call a contradiction. How are we going to resolve the contradiction between a foundation in liberty and a foundation in equality? You can't do it. Well, my conclusion is that the way we did it, and I think we've done it incredibly successfully, is not that I admire that success a lot, but I'm talking about how it has worked. You know, people seem to like it. The fourth stage is what I call libertarian socialism. The idea was you resolve the contradiction which we ourselves have brought about by pushing individual equality and individual liberty and forced equality. You resolve it by breaking the body politic into two bodies. You break it into a physical body and into a public body. The physical body is you and me walking around inside our own skins. And what do we give the people to make them happy? Well, we give them abortion rights. We give them, legalization of drug rights. We give them easy divorce rights. We give them transgender rights. We give them everything you can imagine that has to do with individual sex life and individual pleasure. Keep them pacified, keep them happy. And then they will accept part 2 of the resolution of this contradiction, which is forced equality. And this has happened in America, and it's happened in Canada. You have a court, and we have a court, which is basically treating our own constitution as a living tree. And judges, mostly liberal judges, I think you're in a different situation now. You're maybe going to swing more conservative with Trump's appointments. But in Canada, the whole philosophy of the Supreme Court in Canada is living tree philosophy. You take the Constitution, you basically read meanings into it that may not have been put there by the founders who wrote it, because after all, they weren't here. So we're going to have to rejig it a little bit and read meanings into it and bring about forced equality country to coast to coast. So in Canada, for example, we have socialized medicine, coast to coast. The government doesn't run it, but they control the production of it in every province of Canada. They have a law, and doctors can't break the law. So forced equality rules when it comes to a simple service like that. In our Constitution, that's a provincial right, or what you would call a state right. It's not a federal right, but the federal government just said, well, we'll just tax everybody more, and we'll promise all the lower governments, in our case, the provincial governments, more money if they just go along with our program for socialized medicine, for everybody. And so some provinces fought it very hard and said, no, you can't do that. It's against our own Constitution. Okay, say what you want, but you don't get your billions of dollars transferred to you from us,
Well,
and that's how everybody collapsed and went for it. You see, to me, that's the resolution. That's the resolution of the contradiction which Western liberalism brought upon itself. Okay, and the resolution was libertarian socialism. It's neither true libertarianism nor is it true socialism, God forbid. But it's enough of both that we're getting along, and people seem to be very happy with it. And they're certainly not questioning it. I mean, people like me do. I don't like what's happened, but that's my analysis of the situation. And when people say to me, is this the end of history, like Fukuyama said? I said, no, first of all, history doesn't end until we end, until people end. It was a catchy title, but, crazy idea. But this may be a permanent condition for a very long time because people love their personal pleasures. They're not that concerned about liberty as they used to be, and they're certainly not that as concerned about virtue as they used to be. The whole idea now is your virtue is your virtue and mine is mine. I mean, good heavens, that's why I wrote The Great Divide. I go to a party and have a glass of wine, and I'd walk over to try to talk with someone I didn't know, and I'd say something that I thought was indisputable, and they look at me and they say, "Well, it's true for you, but it's not true for me." That's my moment. Then I look right in their eyes and I say, well, it can't be true and false at the same time, meaning one of us must be wrong. Yeah. Why don't we talk about it and see which it is? And they go drink with someone else. They don't want to talk about it because why do you have to talk about it if it's your virtue?
The idea of virtue as applied to what society used to be. And the idea of virtue is applied to even the ideas of what parts of equality should the government enforce, and how does oftentimes equality manifest inequality? Because I think that's one of the big concerns modern conservatives have, is they believe that forced equality can only work by fixing the game against certain parts of society, making it more difficult for some people and easier for others. And what do you call it? Equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity, right? That's one of the big points. But I think let's start with the idea of what the belief in virtue used to be. You mentioned that people in the past, they wanted the freedom to be good, and that is a profound concept. But I would say that if you understand classical education, it's not that profound. Well, it's profound, but it's not that unusual, I guess I should say. And so it's funny, I've been reading Aristotle's Ethics recently.
Yes.
And an important point to note is that a lot of the classical education methods studied classics like this. And it wasn't just the West that studied classics like this, even in China. If you read like the 4 books, you were reading Confucius, you were reading the Book of Rites, which is standards of etiquette. You were reading the Book of Forms, which was like a book of poetry. And you were reading the I Ching about how, your life on Earth coincides with changes in the universe, and changes in society coincide with changes in the universe. It was an education based on being a virtuous person and being able to understand the world as it changes, and forming your own ways of working through these changes, right? The ability to view an issue with wisdom and act in a moral way when approaching that issue, the trials of our character that naturally exist in life. And Western education was based on the same ideas. People were reading Aristotle. They were reading these older books that talked a lot about moral values. And one interesting thing that when it comes to the idea of happiness and virtue is that this is one of the bases of Aristotle's beliefs. And it was an ancient Greek and Roman idea that virtue and happiness go hand in hand. Aristotle's entire book, Ethics, at least the first half that I'm on, I haven't finished it yet, talks heavily about virtue as being something, as being true pleasure, as being lasting pleasure, and that a lot of times the things that are not virtuous might bring temporary pleasure, but will make you miserable in the long run. And so, a lot of people say that when the founding fathers of the United States wrote the Declaration of Independence, they talked about, the pursuit of happiness, that they were also talking about the pursuit of virtue. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about this in terms of how you understand, when you mentioned people in the past wanted the freedom to be good. What did that mean?
Well, I think they understood the good, first of all, to be the objective of all societies. It's not today, by the way. We never hear anyone saying that. We hear them talking about happiness and comfort and all the rest of it. But anyway, their notion was that the good is something all people and all societies should aim for, just as you said. And so everything should be organized in that direction. What was the good for them? Well, for them, the early settlers here, it was mostly biblical in origin. It was had a religious foundation to it, and also a foundation in what people then and today still call the natural law. Do good, avoid evil. Might does not make right. Love thy neighbor as thyself. All these things. These were the foundations of Western morality. It has changed so much, it's absolutely hard to believe. Maybe I'd like to give your viewers just a little indication of how much it's changed, even in the last 50 years. For example, think about our notion of the self. 50 years ago, our notion of the self was about self-discipline, self-reliance, and our duties. What is it today? Today we talk about self-gratification. We call it happiness or something. We talk about self-expression. We talk about, this is one I really don't like, self-esteem. I always said to my children, and I say to their friends, it's not, you can't esteem yourself. You are esteemed by others for doing estimable things. Self-esteem is propaganda. Please, do estimable things and you will be esteemed. So they go, oh, Dad, But anyway, that's a very different notion of the self. that we carry around today. Back then, I'm only talking 50 years ago now, not 5 centuries. What was our notion of liberty and equality? Our notion was liberty under the law and equality in the eyes of God and before the law. And life was about a starting line. I mean, the whole American experiment and the Canadian one was about America is a starting line for people who are escaping the oppressions of the Western world and Europe, especially religious oppression, political oppression. I mean, when you think of all the great minds over there, had to flee their own countries just to say what they wanted to say. It's amazing. So anyway, what do we have today? We have this notion of equality for all, forced equality, as I say. We've switched to a finish line philosophy from a starting line philosophy. The race of life, never mind. If you're not doing well, the system must have caused it. That's why you're not doing well. We're going to get you more or less all to the same finish line with this and that government program, state program, municipal program, whatever, to change things up for you.
We have now also what I've referred to as the morality of immorality, right? And so the morals of the state are that anything goes, right? It's you can do whatever you want, and no one should have the right to judge you by it. But it's gone beyond that, because I'd say even I disagree with this, but I think the libertarian view is, you can't stop anyone from doing anything. They believe, drugs, whatever, you do whatever you want and destroy yourself however you want, and no one's gonna, you do what you want, I'll do what I want, and no one's gonna question you for it. I think that out of kindness, if you see a friend getting addicted to heroin, you should try to advise them not to do it. You know what I mean? You don't let people destroy them. If they want to, it's their choice in the end, but you should have the ability to advise them not to if you see them ruining their lives or harming themselves. Out of kindness and out of a want to help others, you should advise them to lead a good life. And you see how a lot of times, a lot of times things that are momentarily gratifying are self-destructive to a person's real happiness. And it's why you see a lot of these movie stars and celebrities, they have riches and fame and, whatever they want in terms of, sex or whatever, but they're miserable. They're on antidepressants a lot of times. They suffer from insomnia. They can't sleep at night. They're lonely. And I think people these days, they have this idea that happiness is something that it's not. They don't understand what was lost. And we have this new system of morals in society. We're telling people that, not hating them, not being mean to them, but just telling them that, well, even saying at this point, I disagree with you. I don't think that's how people should live, is considered immoral. And so the new morals of the state, right? The new moral of the state, the morality of immorality, is you can do whatever you want, and that is moral. But if you say you don't believe in that, if you say you don't think that's good, then you are immoral, right? It's the people who have values that go against the absolute abandonment of morality who are considered immoral, right? Good is evil and evil is good in this new world, right?
Yeah, and the first thing they say to you if you try it is they say, well, don't judge me, or you're being judgmental. Well, the fact is people who live in moral communities are always judging each other in one way or the other. It can be gracious, it can be insulting, it can be any of a whole range of things. But the idea that we should not be concerned in the least with what our friends and neighbors are doing to us or to their country or to themselves is absolutely new. That's why I said the guy at the party, when he says to me, it's true for you, but it's not true for me, he's your classical moral relativist. He's living in his own little moral bubble. And as long as his bubble doesn't bump into my bubble the way he sees it, everyone's going to get along. But we used to have a common bubble under which we all lived, moral bubble. We all shared certain concepts, just and morality is like a language. You can't invent, well, you can try to invent new meanings to English words, but you probably won't get very far, and you may get locked up and treated with all sorts of medications for trying to invent a babble language, So language is like a common instrument of human action, and so is morality. And unfortunately, today we've moved away from that concept, just as you have described. I'd like to tell your readers a little bit, because you opened this show asking me about why liberals and conservatives will never ever agree. I want to just explain why I
Well,
wrote the
and
book.
that was, of course,
I
the
wasn't talking.
basis of your book you were mentioning, right? The Great Divide. You argue that liberals and conservatives will never see eye to eye. And I mean, go ahead. You're explaining this.
Well, that's because they may see eye to eye on some unimportant political policy and come out with a compromise that works for both sides. But on the fundamental issues of human life, human reality, and philosophy, I don't think there is any agreement, and I want to explain why. And I thought it was time to drill down because we're coming to a point where we are so divided, nobody's actually engaging in meaningful conversation. We're shouting at each other, you know. So that's why I wrote the book. And the image I used, the metaphor I like to share with people about what I did was there's a man standing on the street. It's a beautiful day. There's lovely, gorgeous buildings around, nice architecture and all that. Suddenly, this enormous gash opens in the street. It's huge, and everything starts to shake, and the buildings are crumbling, rubble everywhere. And he goes, "Oh my God, it's an earthquake." But of course, it's not an earthquake. It's the consequence of the earthquake. The actual earthquake is invisible. It's taking place out of sight, below the ground, where you can't see it, and the grinding of the geological forces that are causing the rubble at the surface. Well, political and moral life are the same things. See, and I wrote in my book because I think that the political and moral rubble that we're all shouting about are being caused by invisible ideological forces that are grinding away beneath the surface. And the purpose of this book was to reveal what those forces are and why your society is going to get in trouble when you start debating certain things, like, for example, the concept of reason. You know, your typical Western liberal is going to be arguing that reason is everything, right? And a conservative is going to say, no, reason is a tool. It's a tool, and what reason can create, reason can destroy. We need something a lot more than just reason. You know, life is not a mathematical formula, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have very, very different conceptions of what reason is, just as we have very different liberal and conservative conceptions of what democracy is. You know, a typical liberal, I mean, this went way back to the French Revolution, would say that democracy is about the now. It's about the will of the people now. You know, it's not about the past, the present, and the future, which is more of the theme that we get from conservatives like Edmund Burke. He called himself a liberal, but that was in the days when liberals were more conservative. So anyway, so a very different conception of democracy. So during the French Revolution, if a marriage wasn't working, the French would say, well, it's over. If one of you doesn't agree with the marriage, it's over. There's no meeting of the minds. But a conservative would say, nonsense, you know, it's a contract. It's not two to make it, one to break it. It's two to make it, two to break it. Even if we decide you're allowed to break it. A very different conception of things like that. So whether it's whether it's democracy or, as I say, reason, or most of these social issues, the reason we're getting in trouble is because we have fundamentally different ideas about what underlies these aggravations. You know, homosexuality, abortion, euthanasia. The last part of my book goes into depth treatment of those issues and why liberals and conservatives will never agree on those so-called social issues. You can't agree on them when you have entirely different philosophical and moral principles going into the argument in the first place.
Yeah. You know, I think for the second part of this episode, it'd be good to talk about, I'd say, the consequences of these ideas. What are the outcomes of these ideas? I would say that, you know, or maybe even deeper, we talked about the idea of, you know, say, stability from below or stability from above, which is really the main idea, the main conflict between the ideas of freedom and socialism, right? The idea of freedom is based on an individual being able to live harmoniously within the boundaries of being able to choose how he or she, you know, lives their lives. That a person, when faced with a trial, can make a proper decision. That people, when placed in communities, are capable of making that community stable and, you know, maybe prosperous, but at the very least stable. Whereas the socialist idea is that the individuals, although maybe they should be given more absolute moral freedom, and anyone who says otherwise should go to prison, right? but that you know, they should be given endless indulgences, right? In terms of you know, that's the idea basically of freedom under socialism. But at the same time, the state should control every technical decision in their lives. That every technical part of their lives, of their employment, of their work, of their health, of their families, right? All this should be dictated by the state. And these are two wildly different concepts, actually, when it comes to the ideas of what socialism actually entails, and the idea of what freedom actually entails.
We can't agree on those. What you're outlining is kind of what I'm saying. We cannot agree on those differences because there is no agreement. They can't be put together. That's why you're seeing such a divide in America right now. We have the same thing in Canada. Oh, it's a little quieter, but you have a lot of it there. Every night I turn on the TV and I watch Fox or CNN or whoever I happen to be watching, trying to get all sides of this thing. I mean, it's all out now. 3 or 4 years ago, it was still a little bit below the surface, but now it's all out. You got people running around your streets with black masks on and hiding their faces and beating each other up. Most of the rest of us are saying, what is going on in America? This land we've all loved and have seen as a beacon of liberty and, for so long. But I think what's happening is the very ideological forces beneath the ground that I've been talking about are becoming visible in the rubble at the surface. And that's why it's important to understand the forces. Take the concept of human nature. Your typical liberal is going to say that human nature is malleable, obviously, and we can change it by law. We can have the perfect society here on earth. This is what secular theologians, you might say, are arguing. Nonsense with all that religious stuff about, heaven after we die and all that sort of thing. We can create heaven on earth. We can do it with policy and law because human nature is malleable. And the conservative will say, no, it's not malleable at all. You should be adapting to the laws to the realities of human nature and let people live, get your foot off their necks, that kind of thing. Now, those are fundamental differences. How are you going to resolve the difference in the conception of human nature? Is it malleable or is it fixed and permanent and like forever? I tend to take the second view, but I outline in my book, and I'm trying my best not to take sides in the book. At the end of every one of these 14 chapters, there's a table where you can pick up the book and compare yourself on every one of these issues. Which side are you going to take on this ideological war of values and war of beliefs? I think, frankly, excuse the immodesty, but I think it's one of the first books that I have ever seen, which actually does such a thorough job of outlining the left-right differences or the liberal-conservative. When I say liberal, by the way, I mean modern liberal. A true classical liberal is not a man of the left, but the modern liberals are in the way that I described. They became that way through the mutations of liberalism that I described. And they're very happy with their libertarian socialism because they want personal freedom, to drink, smoke, have sex, run around, do whatever is, pornography. I mean, you name it. Wow, isn't this wonderful? But they also want the state to control you, the size of your fireplace. You know what I mean? Like everything in your life will be controlled. And if we can give you, look at now, you're having this huge debate down there about socialized medicine. I just wrote an article for Epoch Times newspaper on, so Americans want Canadian healthcare? Think again. Well, you better think again before you do it because it's close to bankrupting some of our provinces. And if we weren't lending them so much money from the federal level, they would be bankrupt. And some of them, it's so-called medical care. I say so-called because some of it's not really medical. It's like lay psychiatry, you know what I mean? My own doctor says 15% of his patients are what he calls the worried well. But he sends a bill into the government every time they come. And it's 80% of spending in some of our provinces if you subtract all the lending and borrowing that they're doing, So, and 40 years ago, 50 years ago when it started, it was like 20%. So this thing is going to creep like a Pac-Man and eat up the whole budget. So compromises will have to be made. The ideals of free, of course, it's not free, it's prepaid. We have very large tax bills here, which pay for the medical care. So we pay in advance. Americans do that a lot too, because you have your Medicare, your Medicaid, and all that kind of thing. And corporations probably pay you less than they might because they're funding your healthcare policies and all that kind of thing. So in a way, you're paying in advance too, but you also go to the doctor and you pay out of your pocket a lot. In Canada, it's not allowed for a lot of service. If it's a listed service that the government's supposed to cover, it's illegal for the doctor to take your money and illegal for you to ask them to do it for a fee. Yeah, I can't go to my doctor and tell him I'd be happy to pay him. You know, I don't want to line up at some hospital. Would you please do so and so? You say, I can't take money from you.
And why would
And he can't
people want
charge
to
me.
do that? Is it because of the waiting lines, or because maybe certain forms of care are not given by the hospitals, or what is it?
Well, when all this began, the whole idea was everybody would get free medical care. You know, everybody could have filet mignon. It wasn't about hamburgers. You know, everybody could have whatever they needed. What they needed would be determined, of course, by the doctor and the patient talking about it, doing the tests and all that kind of stuff. But the long and short of it is that no sooner gets off the ground and you have scarcity. Too many people lining up for scarce resources. We have way fewer everything than you do per capita. Way fewer beds, way fewer nurses, way fewer CAT scan machines, way fewer MRIs, way fewer everything. So in Canada, they say, I'm picking a number right now, but I can find the exact one for you. It's produced every year. There's something like 1 million people on wait lists, some of them for very serious surgeries and some of them in a great deal of pain. And Canada's own Supreme Court has come out and warned Canadians, I couldn't believe it, but they finally did, that people do die in Canada waiting for health care. Now, what's one of the things that Canadians who can afford it do? Well, they go to places like America and other countries to get offshore medicine. I've done it myself. I went to Mayo to get treatment that I couldn't get here. The doctor said to me, well, I said, I think I need so-and-so test. He said, well, you're not sick enough. We can't do it for you until you're really sick. And I said, no, thanks. And I went to Mayo and got what I wanted. It cost me a couple of $1,000s. That's money that could have been spent in Canada, but it's against the law. He wasn't allowed to give me the test. You know, same with certain great scanning machines that we all know about, high resolution scanners. You know, you have to line up in Canada. We have a committee which says, okay, Josh, you qualify. We can give it for you, but we can't give it to Bill because his case isn't bad enough yet. You know, that kind of thing. So
It's
in a
like
sense,
your illness has to reach an advanced stage before they treat it. Huh?
yeah. So in a sense, and I don't want to diminish some of the great medical treatment, because you can certainly get for $250 billion a year, which is what Canada spends. We're only the size of California after all in population. You can get a lot of great medical care here, but you're going to have to wait for a lot of it, for sure. I remember when I wanted to get my shoulder done because I had a terrible athletic injury, I was told there were only 2 people in the Toronto area actually doing shoulders. And one of them, it would be a year before I could see him and 2 years before surgery, even if he decided to go ahead. Well, I had to use influence, which I happened to have had at the time, to get in earlier. And 8 months later, I had a new shoulder. But that's how long it took. You know? Some people are in terrible pain waiting for these things. I'm advising America to read that article in Epoch Times. I think, frankly, it's the most concise summary you will find of the problems of socialized medicine as practiced for 45 years by your northern neighbor.
Yeah, well, and this is a good point too, is that one of the things that socialism does is it creates this bureaucracy that ironically a lot of people think it does away with. And it also creates this kind of subsidized corporatism in a way. And so I would say, if you were to ask me, you know, so my father-in-law, he was a physician in Cambodia. Actually, he has a really incredible story. He was, you know, there were only a handful of physicians in Cambodia. He had studied in France. And when the Khmer Rouge took over, you know, the communists, they put him in one of the killing fields. You know, he was going to be killed. And he, you know, escaped, actually, because he realized that it was his only hope of survival, made it to Thailand, and they got amnesty in France. But he said something interesting. He said in the early days, now he treated the king. There were not a lot of physicians in Cambodia. He treated the king, but he would also treat peasants. And people who did not have money would pay him in like fruit and things like that. And even though he wouldn't really ask for it, they wanted to give him something, but they had no money. And that's the way medicine used to be, as he explains it, is that doctors did it because they made an oath to save lives. That was the basis of medicine. And he said that in his conversations, he and his fellow physicians believed that when medicine became business, the role of the doctor would end. And the problems a lot of people see with healthcare as it is in the United States these days is that the costs are too high. The costs are too high because of interventionist policies, one, that have made it a very high cost to maintain, you know, become a doctor and keep your license and deal with lawsuits and these kinds of things. and two, because of the pharmaceutical industry, which is able to fix prices and charge huge, ridiculous amounts of money for drugs that people need for their survival. And in other words, it's the business, right? It's the business that came in and killed what used to be a functioning industry that actually cared about human life. Not to say that not all of them don't care about human life these days. But the problem with socialized healthcare is it doesn't get rid of the problem. It gets rid of the ability of people to afford these crazy prices. Instead, what it does is it has government subsidize these crazy prices. It doesn't lower the prices, it subsidizes them. And this is why you have, big businesses advocating for socialism, which should absolutely go against them. If socialism, as a lot of people interpret it, actually went against, big business and capitalism, as a lot of socialists these days think it does. No, it subsidizes the problems. It takes all the problems you see and makes it so they will never go away unless the system itself collapses, which is ironically where Marx thought it would go. He didn't plan on these systems to be sustainable. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, on the nature of kind of what socialized healthcare does when it comes to the business of medicine, because I think this ties into an interesting point of what we were talking about before in terms of what socialism actually achieves as opposed to what people think it achieves.
Well, first of all, I've been in the business world myself as well as the academic world, and in some ways I prefer the former to the latter because you get a certain degree of face-to-face honesty, which you don't get in the university. In the university, you may have wonderful meetings with your committee members and walk and realize that they've really stabbed you in the back 5 minutes later. In business, they'll walk up to you and say, "I'm going to stab you in the back because I don't like what you're doing." At least it's full frontal confrontation. Anyway, back to the role of business and government. I think business, for the most part, is going to go where the money is, and it's amoral. Not always, and not all business people for sure. Some of them are highly moral people, but a lot of them are simply guided by the profit principle, and they're going to go get the money where they can. And if they can bend and distort and twist a socialist system of government to make more money, they'll do that.
We had often seen that. When it came to the Soviet Union, a lot of it was propped up by Wall Street in the U.S. Same thing with today's Chinese Communist Party. It's propped up by Wall Street in a lot of ways.
I was one of the first. I was one of the first people in Canada to come out against the ending of the traditional definition of marriage in Canada as a union of one man and one woman. Now it's the union of any two persons. That's from our own Supreme Court. That's marriage is defined as the union of any two persons. It's ridiculous, and I fought it like crazy to preserve the traditional definition of marriage. And who came on first in defense of homosexual marriage in Canada was the Toronto Dominion Bank, my bank. And I called up the president because I knew him. I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You're coming out against something that's been valued in our society for like 1,000 years or more. I mean, forever. Why would a bank take this position? More customers, more accounts, that kind of thing. Completely divorced from any responsibility for the impact of that policy on the public good. No conception of the public good, actually, just public profit. So we must be aware. This is the war, Josh, as you know, that we're all fighting from all sorts of different sides. And the reason I wrote The Great Divide is because I thought we need some clarity in the discussion. We need people to be able to sophisticate what they're actually arguing. And if we're going to have a difference of opinion, at least it's not just about emotion. It's about points, philosophical and moral points that they're trying to make and that they feel able to speak clearly about. Right now, I can't believe it. I mean, I had a friend I was at the cottage with last week. He said, "My wife told me not to talk with you about Trump because I happen to think Trump's saving America. And I don't like a lot of aspects of his character, fine. But I don't know him. I've never been to dinner with him. I'd be able to say better after that. But from what I see, a lot of things he says and does, I wouldn't want my kids to speak that way or to act that way. But I think about most of his policies, I have no argument. I think he's saving America from itself. And I told my friend that. And he just went into the most vitriolic rant about Trump and his character than I could believe. And I said, "Daryl, put him in a white box. Put Obama in a white box. Put any president in a white box. And just tell me about what's coming out of the box, the policy." And I went through them. I said, "How do you feel about his 2-for-1 policy on getting rid of excess legislation. He thinks about it. Well, that's pretty good. I like that. And then what do you think about his defunding abortion overseas and all that kind of stuff? Well, I think that's a good idea too. I went through about 10 of these things. He liked every one of them, but he can't divide. He can't separate his visceral dislike of the person and his own emotion from the facts of the case, which is what Trump is actually doing, you know. And that's what I was trying to do in the Great Divide, was to help people see the invisible ideological forces that work in all our lives today, everywhere.
And I understand, I think you mentioned before that you used to be a liberal or a socialist. You came from the other side, as I think, funny enough, a lot of conservatives did at some point, you know. And I think
some of them make the best conservatives because they've been to the other side. Once they see the error of their ways and take on board the new philosophy, they often are the best conservatives because they know what the other side's all about, better than people who've never been there.
Yeah, I know with myself, I mean, I used to, I think, associate with a lot of those ideas. I didn't really ever consider myself part of a party or anything like that. But
Me neither.
I think for me, and funny enough, a lot of my friends who even these days identify with socialism, you know, a lot of them, and when I knew them, were anarchists. They didn't believe in any government. And they support socialism now based on the same basic idea that they think it's compassionate. They think it's about the individual. They think it's about you know, like fighting against the powers of the state. Basically, they think. And it's funny enough. I mean, as funny as it is looking back, I used to believe a lot of the same things. But what my turning point was realizing that it in no way represents what it claims to represent. It in no way represents compassion. It's a system that in its application has killed something like 100 million people, that in its interpretations in different systems, including National Socialism under Hitler, you know, led to genocide. And you know, under Mao Zedong, even led to worse genocide, 50 to 70 million people. And in its applications in every place lead to absolute tyranny and things like this, you know.
I agree with you. And what I say to people who say that to you is I say, look, you're right. I agree with them right away. You're right. It is compassionate. But it's compassionate in principle, but it's evil in practice. Now, why don't you explain to me why that's so? Why don't you trace the distance, the journey from compassionate in principle to evil in practice? And how does it get that way? Because you're on that side, and whatever it is you're believing is going to end up in evil. And then they start thinking, oh, okay, I didn't think of that. Well, you should start thinking about it. You know, there's that silly saying we've all heard, I guess, about if you're not a liberal by the time you're 20, you haven't got a heart. And if you're still a liberal by the time you're 40, you haven't got any brains. That's because experience teaches us, you know?
Bill, we got about another 2 minutes. And any last points you want to make, talking about the kind of the idea of the Great Divide? And I'm curious, maybe as the last point is, what do you propose for people in terms of kind of restoring some semblance of social harmony in this world between people of really incompatible ideas? What do you propose? I'm curious.
Look, you're asking me to advertise, and I don't want to be too overly self-promotional. It's flavored self-promotion. Read this book. It's the only book I know of which actually lays out in 14 short chapters and with a table for self-examination at the end about where you stand. The subtitle of the book should have been, "Find out how liberal or conservative you really are." And I can't tell you how many people write to me and tell me, "Oh my God, I read your book." And I've one who said he became more liberal because of this book, but almost all of them, it goes in the other direction. Where they say, "I didn't realize how deep this goes in terms of how we value things and how our ideological predisposition. Thank you for writing the book." That's my ad.
And that's The Great Divide by William Gairdner. Bill, pleasure talking with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.